Welcome to Minimalist Thoughts, where we apply the principles of minimalism to all aspects of life so that you can have a purpose driven journey. Hello. Today we want to talk about what to eat based on the glycemic index and the glycemic load. So, before we get into the definitions of glycemic index and glycemic load, let's make one thing clear that sugar is the enemy. We are trying to avoid taking in too much sugar into our body, and we are trying to see how we can lead a low sugar lifestyle so that we don't need to get into taking medications for diabetes or having to prick our finger to check the sugar every so often. So the glycemic index, as defined by the National Cancer Institute, which is a part of NIH, is that the glycemic index is a measure of the increase in the level of blood glucose. So foods with a high glycemic index release glucose quickly and cause a rapid rise in blood glucose, whereas low glycemic index foods release glucose slowly into the blood. So it's quite a basic definition that certain types of foods that you eat will cause your blood sugar, your glucose to rise rapidly, and you'll get a high spike. And other foods that you eat will cause a much lower reaction. And what we want to avoid is that spike in our blood sugar, because the more we spike our blood sugar, the more we get into insulin coming in, being released by our body, and the more we get into insulin resistance, which leads to diabetes and so on. On the other hand, what is glycemic load? Well, glycemic load has to do with the quality of the carbohydrate within the food that you're eating. So it calculates the amount of carbohydrates in a serving of that food. As you know, that certain foods can be more dense than others, and based on how much of that food you eat, you will have a different reaction in your body in terms of the spiking of the blood glucose. So let's talk about that in simple terms. The glycemic index is the effect that the food that you have in your blood glucose level. So there are certain foods that you will eat that will cause your blood glucose level to rise much more than other items. For the glycemic load, we need to do a little bit of math. So, because how much of the food you eat will affect what your blood glucose level is going to do. For example, if you look at a food like watermelon, that probably has a high glycemic index because it's sweet. However, the density of that watermelon is quite low. So the sugar that you're getting from the watermelon will not have as big an effect on you as if you were, say, to eat a milk chocolate bar, because the density of the sugar in there is much higher. So the math that you have to do is you have to take the glycemic index and then the amount of carbs per serving and then divide it by 100. So let's look at a couple of examples. For example, we have white bread. White bread has a glycemic index of 75, and it has a protein level of about 15 per slice of white bread. When we do the math, 75 times 15 divided by 100, we get 10.5. And then look at something like a pecan. They have a glycemic index of 10, which is much lower, and then they have a 4 grams per serving, which will roughly take as a quarter cup, but 1 ounce. and that will give us a glycemic load of 4. So, a little choice quiz here. Which one of these will cause the blood sugar to spike more? Obviously, we can see that it's the white bread is going to cause your blood sugar to spike a whole lot more. And those numbers that I showed previously, don't look at those as absolute numbers, because depending on your source and how you get your glycemic index and how much protein is in there and what the serving size is, they might be off by a little bit. However, the important thing is that those numbers, when looked at in the bigger context, the larger number should be avoided. So how do we consume what we want to eat? Well, you could look up the glycemic index for that particular item that you're looking to eat. You could find the serving size. You can then calculate the glycemic load and then determine how much to eat. However, that does seem quite a bit complex, and usually we don't have that much time to go through all of those items. So we need something more generic in terms of how we are going to look at eating based on the glycemic index of the foods and or the glycemic load. So one thing you should do is look at the things that you commonly eat and then do your search and find out what the glycemic index of those foods are so that get uh, you can then get the glycemic index of those foods and have that readily available when you do eat. If you want to look at generic categories, foods that are high in carbs will definitely have a high glycemic index, such as breads, pastas, cakes, and donuts. And foods that are low in carbs, such as nuts, green vegetables, different kinds of meats, fish, those will have a low glycemic index. When it comes to fruits, you have to be careful because different fruits can take you different ways. For example, berries usually will have lower glycemic index. However, other fruits are very high in sugar, such as bananas and mangoes, grapes, and those will take you in the wrong direction. So that's not somewhere we want to go. Here are some examples of high glycemic foods, and these are generally where their glycemic index is 70 or higher. And in this category, most of our cereals, breads, bagels, rice, pancakes, dates, sodas, and most energy drinks. So I think it's pretty much common sense that these are the foods that we want to avoid or eat in very small quantities. In between is the medium scale, and I guess I define that as 40 to 70. And here are some crackers, muffins, bananas, mangoes, sweet potatoes, different types of beans. Again, in the high, definitely avoid not eat at all. In the medium, go very easy on what you eat in the medium glycemic index. And in most of your foods, you want to stay in the low glycemic index. So here you have beef, fish, eggs, things like cauliflower. Most of the nuts fall in this category. Green vegetables, berries. Berries are one fruit that have lower glycemic index, so you could eat those. Obviously, not in very large quantities. Creams, heavy whipping cream, cream cheese, and then different kinds of cheeses if you're fond of those. So these would have a low glycemic index. And these are the kinds of foods that you want to eat on a regular basis. So eat most of your food from the low glycemic index and very small quantities from the high index, and go easy on the ones from the medium index. And you have to remember that even if you eat large quantities of low glycemic index foods, you might end up then spiking your blood sugar because of the volume of the food that you're eating that could cause the glycemic load for that meal to be very high. So these are some of the things that you should keep in mind, and I wish you well as you continue your journey towards a healthier you. If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button down below as we continue to give you and offer more and more informative programs.